Good morning. Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Giuseppe Zaccaria will defend the academic thesis, Institutional Leadership During Tough Times, explaining the responses of international economic organizations to challenges. May I please invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you very much. Dear Dean, dear highly esteemed opposition, dear supervisors, dear colleagues, and dear friends. I'm very grateful to be here today to present my PhD thesis titled Institutional Leadership During Tough Times, explaining the responses of international economic organizations to challenges. I began my PhD research in 2019, just as a key function of the most central multilateral institution within the global trade arena was beginning to fade away. I am, of course, referring to the appellate body crisis at the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. While previous US administrations had mainly rhetorically challenged the WTO and its appellate body, the US under the Trump administration made it clear from the start that this contestation would be taken to another level. By consistently blocking the appointment of all the members of the appellate body, the US essentially ensured the inoperability of that body. By December 2019, the often described demise of the crown jewel of the WTO had become a reality. In fact, the appellate body crisis is only one case, albeit a prime case, behind what is often referred to as the crisis of multilateralism. IOs across the board have been increasingly challenged by various actors and events. Contestation has come from the likes of a traditionally supportive hegemon, such as the US, as well as from rising powers, such as China. In fact, not long before Trump took the nuclear option against the appellate body, China had clearly already signaled its intention to play a more assertive role within the multilateral order. Academics and commentators alike quickly noted how regional and global initiatives by China, such as the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIB, reflected a momentum for alternative institutional frameworks. This drive for alternatives was posed a potential challenge to the already established institutions within that order, such as the World Bank, which are generally led by the US and its allies. Fast forward to 2020, and the world faced the COVID-19 pandemic, a global disaster of which I need not say much, as we all are familiar with. Apart from its disastrous effects on societies and individuals, the pandemic also posed a challenge to many institutions. In particular, newly established ones, such as the AIB, which now had to face a potentially harder institutional consolidation process. Oftentimes, the debate surrounding such challenges faced by multilateral institutions followed with an eye on the role of state actors. This is despite a vibrant scholarly endeavor exploring the role and influence of international bureaucracies within the decision and policymaking processes of IOs. Having joined the Next Year project on the decline and death of IOs in late 2019, it quickly became clear to me that my research would focus on advancing our understanding of the responses of IOs themselves to challenges. More specifically, and with an eye on the fascinating insights offered by past and recent studies in the IR literature on the agency of IOs and their bureaucracies and how that agency manifests through the bureaucracies of IOs, I constructed my doctoral research around the following overarching question. What role do IO institutional leaders play in shaping the way in which their organizations respond to challenges? In the remainder of this presentation, I first provide some context for the wider audience by explaining why I focus on IO responses. I then present my theoretical argument, which highlights the role of IO institutional leaders in the process behind their responses to challenges. It's quite warm. I then describe the case studies and empirical findings of my dissertation before concluding with their implications. So why the focus on IO responses? In my dissertation, I make the case that IO responses are an important intermediate step in the process that goes from challenge to outcome. The outcome here could be resilience, whereby the IO effectively survives a challenge, or it could be decline, where it loses a function, or it could be IO death, where it essentially ceases to exist. Importantly, IO responses are not the only determinant of the outcome of a challenge, as external factors also critically shape the consequences of challenges. Understanding the outcome of a challenge itself is outside the scope of my dissertation research. My goal is instead to expand our understanding of how IO responses themselves are shaped. IO responses matter, as through them IOs may be able to tip the table to their advantage during tough times. These responses can take various forms. They can be adaptive, whereby IOs accommodate pressures by initiating new policies or institutional change. They can also be resistive, whereby an IO engages in rhetorical and behavioral initiatives to dispute contesters and rally support in its defense. IOs may also strategically engage in non-response, essentially waiting off the challenge and passing the buck to other actors. In explaining how IO responses are shaped, I focus on the actors within the IOs themselves that run their bureaucratic machinery. Within this IO political system, if you will, the most relevant and well-positioned institutional actors are the institutional leaders. These are often executive heads, secretary generals, presidents, and so on. They're often directly supported by an army of staff with the highest expertise and arsenal of resources available within the IO. Institutional leaders are central actors within their IOs. They're positioned strategically in between relevant stakeholders at governing bodies and the mid-level bureaucratic arms of the IO itself that run the organization. As such, they have the widest and most far-reaching access within the political system of an IO. It is for this reason that to understand best how IO responses are shaped, the first step should be to focus on the role played by their institutional leadership. Towards that pursuit, I borrow from the public administration literature on institutional leaders, classics in the literature, to define 3 specific roles that IO leaders can play within the response process. First, IO leaders can take on an authoritative role, employing the institutional powers delegated to their office to make strategic decisions and tailored interventions. For example, allocating resources or reshuffling staff within units that are most affected by a challenge or which are critical to the design and implementation of a response. Second, IO leaders can play a facilitative role, strategically engaging with relevant stakeholders within the organization and strategically framing issues and solutions in order to mobilize key actors and resources for their IO's response strategy to a challenge. Finally, IO leaders can play a symbolic role, acting as figureheads, the public image of their IO, and engaging with outside actors to garner support in defense of the IO during moments of challenge. For example, through public engagements with other IO executives, state representatives, and ministers in capitals, as well as relevant interest groups and civil society organizations. By playing these roles within the various stages of a response process, IO institutional leaders can tailor the way their organization reacts to a challenge. However, the ability of institutional leaders to take on these roles is conditioned by several factors. I rely on the recent study on IO bureaucracies and resilience to define these factors. First, IO institutional leaders must have enough institutional authority and bureaucratic capacity to be able to mobilize and direct their bureaucracies towards an effective response strategy. Institutional authority can also define the scope for internal and external engagement with relevant stakeholders and actors outside of the IO. Where institutional leaders are constrained by the rules and norms of their IO and lack the necessary resources, they will not be able to intervene within their IO, engage with key actors, and ultimately lead a response. Moreover, while authority and resources are critical to leaders' ability to shape responses, whether they actually play a role depends on their leadership competences. Competence here is reflected by a proactive and hands-on leadership approach, where they really engage with the challenge and with relevant actors. Without proactiveness, IO institutional leaders will remain on the sidelines, and as such, they will not be able to play any real role in the response process during tough times. I inductively developed this research, theoretical argument through case studies on the challenges that I mentioned earlier. These are the US contestation of the WTO appellate body, the potential threat to the World Bank by the alternative institutional framework led by China, and the global COVID-19 pandemic's threat to the consolidation of the AIB. I focus on revealing the role of institutional leaders in IO responses to the above-mentioned challenges. I focus on the WTO Director General and supporting Secretariat officials, and the presidents and supporting senior management officials at the World Bank and the AIB. I qualitatively trace the process from the moment a challenge is perceived to its outcome, relying on data obtained through 50 interviews with IO and state officials, as well as experts on the topic. Officials included those working in key management positions, those who worked directly with IO executive heads, understudy, and those who worked in divisions affected by their challenges. Interviewees also included state representatives in IO governing bodies, and I also relied on other primary sources such as IO annual reports and secondary literature. My key findings are that, first, there's a clear variation in the IO responses. The WTO essentially pushed no real response, while both the World Bank and the went for an adaptive response. The World Bank's response prioritized constructive engagement and active interinstitutional relations with the EIB, while the response of the EIB achieved institutional change. Second, my findings show that there's a clear variation in the role played by institutional leaders. At the World Bank, the Jim Kim presidency quickly recognized the implications of China's rise and the momentum for new initiatives. It actively devised a response aimed at ensuring that interinstitutional relations with the EIB would result in the World Bank leading in terms of operational framework and standards, while the EIB would act as a co-financier and generally follow suit with its framework. At the EIB, the Jean LeCun presidency quickly recognized the threat of the pandemic to the young institution's consolidation. Its response was to push for the expansion of the organization's operations beyond its original scope. The scope was traditional heavy infrastructure lending, the demand for which was affected by the pandemic. And this was the challenge that was at play. The EIB instead began engaging more in lending operations in other areas that were high in demand due to the pandemic, such as health and emergency relief. In shaping those responses, these leaders actively facilitated agreement by stakeholders by strategically framing issues and solutions during board meetings, acted as figureheads to garner support during engagements with external actors, and employed their authority and bureaucratic resources to effectively design and implement feasible solutions. They were able to pursue their strategies thanks to the extensive resources, expertise, and complex bureaucracies at their disposal and the key institutional powers that they enjoyed. Furthermore, the presidents of the World Bank and the EIB were proactive in their leadership, exhibiting a strong and hands-on leadership style. At the WTO, in contrast, the institutional leadership remained mainly on the sidelines, even as the demise of the appellate body loomed. The Director General was constrained by the institutional rules and norms of the organization, which limit its authority and inhibit leadership proactivity. And although there was a scope for the Director General to engage with relevant actors to foster solutions, Roberto Azevedo was inhibited by his neutral, hands-off approach to the role, prioritizing instead the member-driven nature of the organization. The findings therefore highlight how the variation in the role played by the institutional actors within the response processes of these IOs were conditioned by whether they had enough authority, resources, and leadership competence. Now, to conclude, my dissertation reminds us that IOs are not eternal institutions, and that their ability to withstand challenges must not be taken for granted. IOs play a critical role in supporting humanity's ability to tackle global problems. As such, state and societal actors may want to ensure that such institutions possess the necessary leeway for effectively responding to challenges. In fact, my dissertation not only sheds light on the oft-ignored agency of IOs in navigating challenges specifically, but also reveals the actors that embody that agency and the strategies that they employ for defending their institutions during tough times. My findings show that IOs sometimes clearly exhibit own agency in their struggles and that their institutional leaders in particular can play a role in how they respond. They highlight the need for accounting not only for the formal powers and bureaucratic resources of institutional actors, but also for the individual leadership competences of their executive heads. The individuals here matter. As such, my findings can aid IR researchers in understanding what goes into the general mixing bowl of ingredients behind an IO's response to a challenge. Moreover, my dissertation encourages policymakers to pay particular attention to the design of IOs, ensuring that they provide their executive heads with enough voice and influence over the decision-making processes. IO design should also provide executive heads with enough budget, staff, expertise, and a solid bureaucratic machinery, over the helms of which they can play a leading role. Where existing IOs lack such attributes, institutional reforms would be a good investment by policymakers, as tricky as that might be. To the very least, policymakers may want to appoint capable executive heads based on merit and leadership skills, as my dissertation suggests that these matter. This would be best done with an eye on inclusivity and transparency, to the very least to uphold the legitimacy of IOs. And on that note, I end this presentation and thank you for your attention. I pass it back to the prorector.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Versluys. Professor Dr. Esther Versluys is Professor of European Regulatory Governance at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University.
Dear candidates, dear Giuseppe, I would first like to congratulate you on a really nicely written and well-researched dissertation. I really enjoyed reading it. I particularly like to congratulate you on managing to conduct this research during the heavy COVID period. To keep it in the light of your own research vocabulary, COVID posed a considerable challenge to the potential success of your PhD trajectory. But you demonstrated sufficient leadership capacities to not let this challenge lead to resistance or non-response. You have the potential disadvantage of coming last in a series of 3 PhD defenses in the same project. Therefore, I would like to relate my question to the larger project of which your PhD was part. Your 2 fellow project members used different types of explanations for behavior in IOs that are challenged. Leonard focused mostly on survival politics, and Laura identified the importance of contestation legitimation processes. Could these approaches also serve as alternative explanations for your particular cases that you studied? And if so, what elements from these alternative explanations do you perceive beneficial in complementing your own analytical approach focused on leadership?
Thank you very much for the question, dear highly esteemed opposition. I quite like this question because it actually brings my research back within, embeds it back within the wider research project, and I wasn't expecting it, so this is actually very nice. Laura and Leonard's PhD projects were very similar to mine in the sense of they looked at challenges that international organizations faced and how they dealt with that contestation. Our projects diverged in our focus on which actors we're looking at and which processes we're specifically focusing on. So I think the specific way in which I can say this project is distinct from the rest of the project is in its focus on leadership within international organizations. So typically in the literature, and this I think is the case broadly within this domain of study, we look at international organizations as unitary actors. Right? So when we think about, for example, Hugo and Marx and the wider research agenda on international organizations and bureaucracies, we think about bureaucracies as being reflected by their secretariat. Right? This was very much the case, I think, also in previous research projects that dealt with contestation of IOs. What I'm doing here is I'm taking a more fine-grained, tuned approach towards understanding exactly which institutional actors are the ones that we should focus on, with the goal in mind being that of understanding how the responses of these international organizations are shaped. This was broadly in line with the research project also that we were all embedded in. But in my dissertation research, what I do is that I try to really bring to the surface the sort of mechanisms and processes that explain the response strategies of IOs. I think the focus on bureaucracies makes a lot of sense because IO agency is often reflected by the bureaucracy of IOs, right? But to dig deeper into understanding which actors within those bureaucracies are the ones we should look at is what my dissertation does here. Another factor that I think is worth noting is the fact that a priori, when we look at international organizations, we think of these organizations as these buildings, these headquarters with staff working at them that are experts, that technocratic experts, that are essentially acting as vehicles for the pursuit of interests of member states. But the literature from decades ago to today really pinpoints how these actors have their own interests that they follow and how the interplay between these interests and member state principal interests affect the IO's policymaking. What I do in this dissertation is essentially to take that, apply it within the context of responses of IOs to challenges. How does this look like within challenges? I'm not looking at whether the outcome is explained by the response, which is what some other research projects, for example, have engaged with a little bit more. I'm looking at how the response is shaped by these key individual actors within IOs. For that, the wider research project and previous projects, for example, Laura and Lowe's, have been really inspirational. Because there you can see the similarities in which across IOs, different actors matter and play key roles in the processes. Sometimes it's secretary generals, sometimes it's staff working for secretary generals, sometimes it's member state representatives, sometimes it's former officials that work at other international organizations. And there I think it's really interesting to see how, yes, it's not only the individual leaders of international institutions that matter, although that is the focus of my dissertation.
So, in a nutshell, which potential elements from Leonard's and Laura's frameworks could you also have used to explain your particular cases?
Yeah. So I think engaging more, for example, with member states, the role of member states, with civil society actors. So for example, Laura engages with the norm of climate change action. And from my understanding, that is viewed as a process by itself, right? And I think within the international development and trade arena, for example, there are normative frameworks that also exist by themselves, right? And to see how the evolution of these normative frameworks are affected by international organizations and how international organizations affect this evolution during tough times would be an interesting thing to consider. I think the other thing to consider would be to see how IOs orchestrate responses, or IO actors orchestrate responses together with other IOs, or engage with powerful members within their membership, such as, for example, Leonard chose in some of his research, to facilitate the process behind its resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Stephanie Walter, Professor of International Relations and Political Economy at the University of Zurich, and Professor Walter is online.
Hello, Giuseppe. Sorry that I could not be there in person. I think you need to mute the auditorium because otherwise we have an echo. Okay, so I'll continue. Great. So what I really liked in your thesis is the focus on the internal processes, which are a nice complement to the existing work that focuses mostly on external context conditions and how IOs respond to challenges. So I think that was very nice. And I was really impressed how you did all these interviews, especially during COVID. And I think they really generated some insights that otherwise you would not have had. So I thought that was really nice. Now, my question to you is whether you can explain why you selected these three challenges, right? How do they allow you to discriminate between your argument and then alternative explanations? And how generalizable are the results from these analyses?
Thank you for that great question, dear highly esteemed opponent. So to answer this question, I would first like to go back to the beginning of my project, basically, right? So when I started my PhD in Professor Hilke Dijksterhuis's project, the idea was that I would focus on the policy arena of trade and development. And that, by definition, narrowed the scope in terms of what sort of international organizations I can engage with and what sort of challenges I can engage with. Oftentimes, these challenges have to do with trade wars, protectionism, etc. The period in which I started my PhD also was exactly on the backdrop of the Trump administration really aggressively, assertively, reflecting its policies in the arena, and on the backdrop of the rise of China within the multilateral institutional order. So in selecting my instances of challenge, in some ways, this was narrowed down in terms of process to challenges that are within that domain and challenges that have recently occurred that are relevant to the rise of China, power distribution change, shifts in power distribution, and populism, essentially, and the backlash against international institutions, as very clearly reflected by the Trump administration. That was one consideration that was essentially contextual. The other consideration was that in examining the responses of international organizations, one could say that it is not the challenge that matters, it is the role played by institutional leaders in shaping those responses. What difference it makes what the challenge is like could come down to essentially the competences of the institutional leaders and the organizational context in which they operate. Right? So if organizations are similar and to some degree they provide a sample where we would expect there to be a response strategy pushed by their institutional actors, the institutional leaders, then the challenge itself shouldn't really matter. Right? Of course, in inductively and exploratively engaging with the case studies, it is clear that all these contextual factors matter. These are external factors that shape not only the way an institution can react to a challenge, but also the consequences of the challenge on the institution. And as such, I understand your question, and I would I would essentially say that the case selection strategy evolved through this inductive process of looking at these IOs. So it began with the selection of the IOs themselves. Now, a consideration there was whether these IOs are most likely cases where we can actually observe whether institutional actors played a role or would have played a role, hypothetically, in responding to a challenge. And there again, the focus was not on the challenge, but the IO itself, right? So the key aspects of the case selection strategy generally fell upon the selection of IOs rather than the challenges for that reason. And these are all large IOs, which previous research has shown also within the project that these are the type of IOs where we can expect there to be a response to a challenge taking place because they're IOs with higher capacity than their peers that are smaller, and they're all IOs within the same policy domain, although they have differences in terms of, for example, the WTO being more of a regulatory IO and the World Bank being more operational. Another consideration that I think is worth mentioning is these had to be recent challenges, recent instances. So when I began my PhD research within the project, the idea was that it would be based on qualitative research, right? And to do so, the goal was to engage through interviews with relevant officials and actors within these organizations to really get this fine-grained picture of what happened behind the resilience or not of these organizations. And there, relying on interviews that on interviewees who have a more recent memory of the events made sense. So that also narrowed down the selection of instances of challenge. Finally, these are instances of challenge that are very salient. They're salient to the academic endeavor in understanding IOs, but they're also salient to the wider public. We're talking about the Trump administration. We're talking about the potential impacts of the rise of China as an actor within the multilateral system, but also at the same time effectively establishing alternative frameworks there. And so for that reason, it made sense to me to focus on challenges like that, because they are the ones that are key. Thank you.
So let me give you two alternative explanations, and I'd like to hear what, why you think that the leadership qualities or leadership processes that you describe, why you think that those are more valid explanations for the variation that you observe in these three cases, right? So the first one is, it could be that a challenge that is raised against an IO by the most powerful member state and the hegemon, like the US in the WTO case, is much harder to address than a challenge that originates from a rising power, like the World Bank case, or an external event, like the COVID case, right? So that would be one, alternative explanation. The other one would be is that it's just simply much harder to manage any challenges in a unanimity setting, right? Like the WTO, rather than in settings where you have qualified majority voting, like the World Bank or the AIIB, right? So, it's not clear to me that there's so much variation in these cases that I wondered how they allow you to discriminate. So if you think of other challenges that you could have picked, like say, the big debate about voting rights in the IMF, then you would also at least have qualified majority voting and these kind of things. Why did you not pick these?
I think there's a bit of a weak internet connection, but if I understood correctly your question, and the second part of it, essentially, my response is, when my dissertation looks at the response itself, the response strategy, right? So I agree that when we look at, for example, the challenge emanating from a powerful member state like the US, a hegemon, we're looking at a context that's different from that emanating from contestation by China, which is a rising power. And also within different institutional contexts, the WTO consensus-based versus, for example, the AIIB, where the senior management is center key, essentially, within the organizational structure. I read that through, but I also at the same time think that let's consider what a response would look like and how would this challenge actually affect the response process, right? So within the response process, the institutional leaders, the way I define their role within the dissertation would be reflected by engagement with relevant stakeholders, would be reflected by agenda setting where they have the power to do so, would be reflected by engagement with external actors and as public images, figureheads of the organization, public statements basically that they would make. It would be reflected by intervening within the organization where they deemed that to be necessary, right? So whether the challenge is coming from the US or it's coming from a rising power, I would expect the institutional leaders to nevertheless still play a role. Their role to be reflected in some way within the dynamics of the I.O. It might be harder to play a public role within the WTO. Of course, the WTO is a very member-driven organization, and we can imagine how the pressure of this consensus-based character of the organization very much inhibits any role by the Director General. But then previous Director Generals are quite famously known to have been very proactive and very vocal about their opinions, but also about the direction that the organization should take and about the role that members should play within the organization. I'm of course talking about Renato Ruggiero and Pascal Lamy within the WTO. So there again, the challenge did come, for example, from the US, a different form of challenge and at a different stage actually within the same process of challenge that I'm studying here in this dissertation. But then there was variation in terms of how much of a role Pascal Lamy played in the WTO during that stage of the tough time versus the role that Roberto Azevedo played. So I think here, actually key to answering your question is the focus on proactivity and leadership competence makes sense out of this research endeavor. And in a sense, makes it likely that engaging with different forms of challenges should not matter too much in terms of the role we're trying to reveal these institutional leaders playing within the response process.
Are you satisfied with the answer?
I think we could debate this longer. You know, I mean, if you know, I mean, of course we expect leaders to play at least some role, but I think sort of I think ultimately I'd be interested sort of what part of the, like how causal is this and how consequential is this ultimately? But I think we can also debate this for a very long time. So I think we could also move on to the other.
Thank you so much. So we will now continue with the opposition. And the opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Michael Bauer, Professor of Public Administration at the European University Institute in Florence. And Professor Bauer is also online, and I hope we will see you soon. Yes. Professor Bauer, you have to unmute yourself, the classical.
That's true, the classical. So, I mean, it's such a nice introduction. And now there's an echo, I understand as well. Great. Yeah, sorry, I made such a nice introduction that I cannot repeat because I think it was so spontaneous and so nice saying, Giuseppe, that I support you in looking at leadership, that is really important variable and maybe a least understood variable. But let me stop here and check whether everybody understands me. Give me a feedback.
Mute myself now. We hear you well.
That is good because I have some time lag, I think. But anyway, so I keep on. So thanks a lot for this. And let's keep on the conversations we had now also with Stephanie. Because what I would like you to tease out a bit in our conversation is you have leadership as a variable, fair enough. And you have organizational, institutional capacity given to a leader also as a variable. And I would like you to reflect and to convince us about the choices you made to kind of conceptualize, to catch this, to kind of empirically kind of dig into these two variables, yeah, to clarify how you measured them, if you wish. And explain a bit or kind of dissolve my doubt in the direction that there might be an overlap. So my challenge would be, I would like to challenge you whether you have at the empirical level of your analysis here not a certain overlap between these two variables you use. And I would like you to convince me that this is not the case and that you still can kind of clearly distinguish as a variable your leadership.
Thank you very much, dear highly esteemed opponent. So I was a bit struggling again in understanding the question because of the, I think, internet connection. But if I understood correctly, you asked whether I could explain a bit more how I conceptualized and measured the variables, and to explain a bit more, or explain why there is no overlap between them. Correct. So essentially, starting off the research project, I thought about how we can actually measure leadership within international organizations. As you can imagine, this was quite a struggle, especially because it has to do with individuals within international organizations. And not necessarily the secretariats. So the starting point for me was to look at the formally delegated tasks and functions of these organizations. We're very familiar all, I think, with these measures, for example, delegated agenda setting and decision-making, etc., at the level of the secretariat of these organizations. That's the starting point. I conceptualized further there then within the dissertation what exactly institutional authority means. And here it is really a sort of formal measure of what institutional actors leading the secretariat or bureaucracy of an organization can do. So their scope of action. Can they engage in agenda setting? Can they chair meetings, for example, etc. In that process, though, we are capturing the more formal aspects of authority within the leadership level of an international organization. And what I do is I rely on my case studies to essentially inductively explore in what other ways can we actually measure leadership within these international organizations. Here again, I'm focusing on the component that is institutional authority, right? And there, the norms and the culture surrounding the scope of action of international organizations matter. So this is not very often reflected within data sets, for example, that there are on the delegation of authority and functions to international organizations. It's something that when one delves into an international organization qualitatively, really, one can find out through interviews. And that was quite interesting. So when we take the case of the WTO, for example, to some degree, the hands of the Director General are tied by the culture of the organization, and that defines its institutional authority within the organization, right? That is to a degree that is not the case within the World Bank and much less the case within the AIIB. So there, inductively, I approached the operationalization of these measures. Bureaucratic capacity differs from institutional authority in the way I explain it within the dissertation, whereby bureaucratic capacity has to do with the arsenal of tools available, institutional tools available within the bureaucracy of the international organization. So how many staff work within the bureaucracy? Their expertise, are these experts within an area? For example, the Secretariat of the WTO comes to mind. Are these legal scholars, for example? So does the international organization's leadership have at its disposal in-house expertise, basically? And I explained this further in the dissertation. But it doesn't stop there, of course. Bureaucratic capacity is also defined by whether the organization allows there to be a sort of vertical line of authority within the bureaucracy. So can institutional leaders stand on top, echelon, within the structure of the bureaucracy to essentially lead these other institutional actors below them that can support them with their expertise? Finally, the resources that are reflected by the budget of the organization matter there. So these three indicators are separate from what is the degree of delegated functions formally to the institutional leadership, in as much as that variable essentially reflects how much scope for action the institutional leader has, while the bureaucratic capacity reflects the resources that the institutional leadership has for engaging in that scope of action. Proactivity, on the other hand, has to do with the individual, right? So having enough institutional authority or bureaucratic capacity cannot by itself explain whether this individual, this leader, actually engages with the challenge, actually takes that scope of action and the resources available to them to push forward a response formulation and implementation process, right? In that sense, I don't view them as overlapping within the dissertation, as they capture different aspects of how much an institutional leader can actually act. I hope my answer answers your question.
I think we see very clearly that we as political scientists, we want to kind of measure institutional kind of factors and then kind of transfer this somehow to the individual. But leave me, what are the individual kind of traits that you can say that distinguish your leaders? How could you systematize them? What are, on the individual level, those variables that are really distinguish your three leaders?
So let's take the example again of Pascal Lamy and Roberto Azevedo. I think, from my understanding of the really individual level aspect that distinguishes the leadership style of the two, leadership style as I define conceptually within my dissertation, is their proactivity, how entrepreneurial they are, as the classics in public administration define, in engaging with issues, in engaging with actors. So thinking about Pascal Lamy, a common story within the WTO is that he would take up the phone and call ministers in capitals. Whenever there was an issue, whenever there was something that he wanted to engage with, there would be a direct intervention there in that sense, right? This is not necessarily to say that this reflects a direct intervention within the appellate body or within the way resources are allocated within the secretariat of the appellate body, but it still reflects an intervention there, right? And the way I conceptualize leadership proactivity and operationalize it within the dissertation essentially captures this element. Whether the institutional leader actually takes the helms, takes the phone up, calls someone, or calls for a meeting with relevant parties within the organization. Take the case of Roberto Azevedo, and he's quite known to have been neutral, very hands-off in his stance. How can we explain this? It might have to do with the background, civil service versus diplomat. But at the same time, it, to some degree, reflects the leadership approach of the individual in general. It would be interesting to compare how these leaders operate within different international organizations to see if there is some degree of generalizability there in terms of whether leadership proactiveness actually captures that style they exhibit. But within the WTO, within the same organization at least, this is how this was reflected in the way they differently approached issues at hand. In other words, whether they're entrepreneurial or not.
Thank you.
So much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Clara Weinhardt, Assistant Professor in International Relations at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidate, first of all, congratulations for concluding your PhD and making contributions to the existing literature and international organizations. I found the thesis particularly well written and structured. It's very easy to follow. It's a pleasure to read. And I think it stands out in terms of the in-depth empirical analysis, the wealth of interviews with key decision makers that you managed to conduct during the pandemic. So congratulations for this. The question I have actually follows up upon something you just discussed, because the way I read your thesis, you're explaining variation in institutional leadership very much with institutionalist factors and leadership competence. But something that came up now repeatedly is this thing called institutional culture. And in the WTO, there is this institutional normative culture of not being too activist. And yes, I agree, the DGs have interpreted their role differently, but they all hit a wall. We see the current DG, Okonjo Iweala, being much more activist, member states criticizing for her. So can they really make a difference just by being more activist if there is an institutionalist culture that doesn't want to see this. So doesn't your framework need to contain a bit more of this normative sociological part? And it's not just a theoretical question, because I think one of your recommendations for the WTO case is to strengthen institutional authority of the leaders. And I'm wondering how this will fit together with an institutional culture, which is the opposite, and maybe even saying that at the root of the appellate body crisis is too much institutional authority of the appellate body.
Thank you so much for that question, your highly esteemed opponent. So here I feel a bit like an aspect of my dissertation has been revealed that I would have very much liked to develop further before having submitted it, which is to engage a bit more with this sociological approach to how institutional culture and dynamics within international organizations work, which is a fascinating literature. A very wise person once told me that a PhD dissertation is always a work in progress. And at some point, one has to just decide when that's kind of done and then when to get back to it, maybe later in the future. And this is exactly an element that I am quite interested in getting back to in the future. And not only in the case of the World Trade Organization, but also the other international organizations for which we know very little, actually, especially regional ones and smaller ones like the AIIB, in terms of the institutional culture within their bureaucracy. Now, I agree with you that institutional culture, again, with the case of the WTO, which I think is really the prime example for engaging with this topic, not only defines the scope for action for an institutional leader, but very much actively can clash with it, right? So you mentioned how could reforms, for example, be tailored to at the institutional design of IOs to increase the authority of their leadership. And you mentioned the clash, for example, between culture and leadership, authority, within the appellate body. The appellate body, the way I understand it in the dissertation, is part of the institution, but the institution's leadership is the head of the secretariat, right? And here, I think what is very interesting, and the reason why I mentioned this, within the case of the WTO, is that the WTO Director General actually has quite some delegated authority within the international organization. The WTO Director General has say in firing officials, even within the appellate body secretariat, in their appointment, in the allocation of resources, in the shuffling of staff, basically, around the institution. There, the clash with culture has more to do with the culture that has borne out and evolved within the institution, rather than the setup in which the institutional leadership was meant to operate. So here, maybe I'm taking a bit of a normative approach. I would think of institutional culture as an aspect that needs to be tailored rather than balanced with vis-a-vis institutional authority when it comes to institutional leadership. Because culture, in the case of the WTO, essentially inhibits any action. However, at the same time, and here I'm returning to the first part of your question, when we think about the Director General of the WTO, and we look at the agreements of the WTO, basically, and what role the WTO Director General can play formally, again, there was scope for action, right? Previous Director Generals have, engaged there, and the new Director General also. But this does not necessarily mean that they need to get on the podium and yell at the USTR, right? It can also simply be having informal meetings with the parties in dispute. So in the case of the WTO appellate body crisis, not much was done there in that regard, right? I mean, meetings were called by Roberta Azevedo at the end, towards 2019, to engage with the US and parties within the WTO. And one could make the case, of course, that success was inhibited basically by the parties themselves, right? But that reflects engagement. And it reflects engagement that can occur despite a heavy institutional culture that really imposes the member-driven character within, for example, the WTO. So I do not think that the clash between culture and authority should be a concern when, for example, designing international organizations. I think it should be more a concern that institutional authority trumps institutional culture that may develop.
And maybe can you reflect briefly on your policy recommendation that increasing institutional authority is going to address the root cause rather than trying to foster a different institutional culture?
In my propositions, you mean? So I do not think that increasing institutional authority addresses the root cause of the issue there. I may have understood your question incorrectly, but that was what you just described, right?
Yeah, I'm referring to the proposition where he says the bureaucratic leadership suffers from limited institutional authority and the WTO deserves more teeth to ensure full functionality.
Right, and how that clashes with institutional culture. Well, again, going back to my answer earlier, I would think that this clash should not be much of a concern because giving more teeth to the institution, as I say in the proposition, I mean giving more teeth to the leadership of the institution, so at the higher echelon, so the Director General, for example, at the WTO, rather than giving more teeth to the member states in the governing bodies or to the appellate body secretariat, right? And there, normatively, there may be a clash in the sense of, do we want an international organization to reflect more the interests of the member states and essentially follow suit, be a vehicle for that, or do we want an international organization to have its own agency? And I think what recent studies have shown, and generally the wider literature on IO bureaucracies has shown, is that it is in the wider interests of societies and member states' principles to have international organizations that are resilient enough during tough times. It's a question of whether we want the institution to be able to defend itself, even if it means it has more teeth, and that might clash with the culture that may be imposed by its principles, or whether we want the organization to not be able to function in one of its key functions, the appellate body.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Johan Adriaanse, Assistant Professor in European Politics at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University.
Thank you very much. Let me first congratulate you also. I think we've also had a very nice discussion up to this point, so it's up to me to ruin it. But I really enjoyed the thesis. Rich empirical insights. It's always nice to read thorough field work and the insights that you obtained from that. I think it's also a very timely topic, and the focus on leadership in times of crisis is also quite fitting. So it was I think it's also a nice step up for more research on this topic. In your earlier discussion, in the response to Professor Versluis's question, you also mentioned that one of the contributions that you make is that you treat IOs not as unitary actors, right? And I want to push you in my question a little bit more on this unpacking the box of the international organization, specifically with your conceptualization of leadership and who assumes such leadership roles. In your responses, actually, you are far more nuanced than in the thesis. But I would argue that actually there's lots of people taking up leadership roles in organizations generally. If you take the pandemic, the way that universities had to cope with it was not just up to the highest authorities, director or the deans, but it also fell upon vice deans, course coordinator, program, like many people take on roles, specifically in coping with education. And I would say that same applies to international organizations. So I want to ask you, why did you focus primarily just on the main, or I would say the institutional leaders, the director generals, and not, for example, also on those taking leadership roles in specific parts of the bureaucracy? Specifically, I think you may know where I come from as a trade scholar, specifically in the WTO, because you mentioned the appellate body crisis, not the WTO crisis. It was a crisis of the appellate body. You also, I think, mentioned in one of the responses that, well, the appellate body has a secretariat. They also have a lot of power. I think there's an article by Paulin and Pelk that also now last year that basically say, well, they have far too much power for a secretariat. And so my question basically is to you is, why focus only on the chief level or on the highest level? And what different findings would you have basically when if you would focus perhaps more on the lower elements of the bureaucracy? Would that change your findings in terms of your research?
Thank you very much, your highly esteemed opponent. Yeah, I really like this question because it is also similarly to the previous question, a matter where the dissertation can really evolve to cover more aspects that are relevant to the theoretical argument made here. So the role of other institutional actors within the bureaucracy of IOs and how they also matter. How do they shape the response process, if I understood correctly the question. And whether the findings would change. So again, we go back to the WTO case, and indeed I do agree that when we look at the appellate body crisis, it was a crisis of the appellate body, as the label says, but it was also more widely a crisis of the WTO. Right? The WTO has been contested since 5 years, basically, after it was established, and the appellate body itself also has been at the center of that contestation by various actors, not only the US, but increasingly the US. This crisis does not reflect only issues that are at the heart of members regarding the appellate body. I think generally the literature also agrees on this, that they reflect strategies employed by principals, member states in this case, to shape the direction that an organization takes, in this case, the appellate body. The appellate body is also an easy case for contesting an international organization. It's a consensus-based organization, so you can see how it's an easy target, essentially. And there are differences between legal scholars in the US and European legal scholars in terms of trade rules and law. So whether other institutional actors, such as the director of the appellate body secretariat, are important and should be accounted for within this response process that I present in my dissertation, yes, the answer to that is yes. I think, however, and I think this answers the first part of your question, the reason why I took off essentially looking at the individual leaders, the leaders at the top, so the executive heads of these international organizations, was because these are the people at the head. Right? These are the ones that are the figureheads also of the organization. They reflect the organization in front of the public, but also in front of member states. And they are the ones with the widest access within the organization. The director of the appellate body secretariat is a very important figure within the organization, as I think we know. And the senior management officials at the World Bank are also very important. The director is very important at the AIB as well. To a lesser degree, maybe because it's a non-resident board. But all of this goes through at the end, the top, the leader of the organization. So when it comes to, for example, engaging with member states, I would find it more problematic if the director of the appellate body secretariat is engaging with member states than if the director general is engaging with member states, considering the institutional culture of the WTO, especially. And there, I would expect, therefore, the Director General to be more involved, and as such, to matter more. I also think that being the leader of the international organization, of the bureaucracy of the institution, essentially implies that they already engage with these other actors within the organization. This doesn't mean that they don't matter. In fact, if anything, I think it highlights the fact that we need to account for their role. It's a very interesting aspect of the dynamics within an international organization that could be uncovered further. I hope that my dissertation essentially lays the groundwork towards that in pursuit of all the factors that we're discussing right now that might be relevant for understanding the role of institutional actors in shaping responses. I also think, in particular, the interplay and coordination between these actors could be interesting. Would my findings be different? I'm not sure. I think that the discussion would be different, but whether the findings regarding the role played by institutional leaders in shaping the response of an organization would be different, I do not think so. Had I focused on whether these institutional actors specifically played a role in shaping the responses of these IOs, yes, then in that case I can imagine how the findings would be more complex.
Okay, then I don't mind because I follow the response in the sense of like if the organization is very hierarchical, that in the end the final responsibility lies with chief executive, but because we're dealing specifically in the WTO also with a court-like system where you do expect a certain degree of independence. So if you would treat the EU and we would ask who are the leaders, we would have different responses, and specifically if you look at the court system, right? So in that sense, I would say, well, in the WTO, it's a little bit in betweenish, but there is a large degree of autonomy, and it aligns with the question of culture, right? That you also think like a court should be independent with limited interference. And then ultimately, the chief responsibilities, I think also as in your table 6.1, you mentioned that, well, the institutional authority of the Director General in the WTO is limited, but at the same time, the bureaucratic capacity, you say like, with high autonomy for appellate body, then the leadership of the appellate body matters comparatively more. So that's why I would push you a bit in this direction, that these institutions or the sub-institutions sometimes actually matter more in dealing with the crisis than the actual leadership.
So I'd like to answer to that question by thinking about what is it about institutional leadership in tough times that I'm looking at, right? So if we were to say, we're looking at whether these actors actually intervene.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Giuseppe Zaccaria, the time appointed for defending your thesis has now passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Traveling so far from home, gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. right to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile or die. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Giuseppe Zaccaria, the degree committee here present, has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Hilke Dijkstra is now authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor. Please all rise.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
Good. By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Giuseppe Zaccaria, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. It's yours. One more picture.
Please be seated.
Pro-Rector, honorable members of the committee, colleagues and students, family and friends, dear Dr. Giuseppe Zaccaria. Congratulations, you're now officially a graduate of Maastricht University. When you arrived here in Maastricht in 2019, after a long train ride from the Randstad, for your interview here as a PhD candidate, you had a clear Leiden stamp on you. And this is also something you like to remind people of. Your 2 years research master at the University of Leiden really was a formative period for you academically. And I think that clarified a lot of your academic and research interests. And if you read the acknowledgement of this PhD thesis, in the very first paragraph, you thank Professor Arjan Boon, who supported you in your ambitions. Now, 4 years later, I believe that something similar can be said about Maastricht. During your recent exit talk, which we had with Professor Esther Versluis, you referred to it. And you said, and I will quote you here, Maastricht feels like home. Now, for me, it's very difficult to think of a more or better compliment than that. I think despite the COVID pandemic, we made you feel at home at the faculty. But I think equally it's important that it's a compliment to you. You know, as an academic who has seen quite a bit of the world, you know, from Iran to Cyprus to Leiden to Maastricht and now to Glasgow, you really invested yourself here, not just in your studies, but also in the academic community and the people wider here in Maastricht. And I think that was very much appreciated. And as you're leaving now to Glasgow, we're going to dearly miss you. Having Giuseppe as part of your research team is really great, because time with Giuseppe is never dull. I vividly remember your first week here in Maastricht when you got food poisoned by the barbecue at faculty. And I think about 2 weeks later, you had a biking accident while touring the hills of Limburg. Stuff happens with Giuseppe. But then there's always that big smile over here, no matter what. As with your fellow PhD candidates, Laura and Leonard, you were part of our broader ERC team on the decline and death of international organizations. And I think while your initial research interest was in environment and climate, we convinced you to focus on trade and finance, and I think you've done that with great rigor. You've taken the bits of the ERC project you found helpful, and you've added some of your own, including the leadership dimension you talked to us about today. What's really amazing is your ability also to do interviews there with officials. So you talk to officials in the World Bank, the WTO, the AIIB, mostly via Zoom, given the COVID restrictions. And despite all these COVID things, you submitted your thesis after 3.5 years. Here you are defending your thesis ahead of the end of your contract, and that's really something that very few PhDs actually do. So congratulations on that. It's a massive achievement. I already mentioned a little bit how COVID affected your fieldwork, but that didn't deter you of getting yourself a very nice visiting fellowship at the EUI in Florence. Indeed, last fall, you were hosted for 4 months by Professor Stephanie Hoffman, whom we're also very thankful for that, to further help develop your conceptual thinking and write up your thesis. Now, you certainly had a good time, but it was also a nice excuse for me to come to Florence. So we had a two-day intensive workshop. You know, we talked about everything inside out about international organizations, and then we still had, a couple of days a weekend as well. So we did a bit of sightseeing together in the Tuscan hills. Our rented car was bright red. It was no larger than a tin can. But yet, it got us up the hill in Tuscany. We managed to get to the market in Greve in Chianti and see the frescoes and towers of San Gimignano and back. And I thought it was a very nice way also to get some bonding together during the whole day while you were writing up your thesis. Now, today you defended your thesis in Maastricht, and it's back to Glasgow, I think, this evening already. Indeed, you started a couple of months ago as a postdoc researcher in the team of Dr. Bernard Reinsberg. I'm really thrilled you got that position. Not only is it a natural transition from your PhD, but you continue to work on international political economy, the World Bank, World Trade Organization, and so forth. Now, Dr. Reinsberg's team is also heavily focused on quantitative research. And perhaps that was one of the few regrets, I guess, from your thesis, whereas in Leiden you had also done quantitative studies, that you really couldn't incorporate some of the quant in this thesis. Now you have 3 years now to verse yourself with all those methods and data sets they have available. But while you engage with that team in your postdoc, please keep on also bringing in the qualitative bits, because when studying international organizations, I don't think there's anything more powerful than walking into these buildings and actually talking to the people who are doing the job, the people behind these data sets, the leaders at the top, but also the bureaucrats elsewhere. So with your quantitative skills and your qualitative skills you gained here, I'm sure you're going to be making massive contributions to international relations research to come. Now, Giuseppe, we're going to miss your smile here in Maastricht. You really colored our world, and I would really want to thank you for your contribution you made to us here in Maastricht. Congratulations.
So, dear Dr. Zaccaria, sounds good, huh? But you have to get used to it. Dear Dr. Zaccaria, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I would like to congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. Congratulations and enjoy the day. I have to say a few housekeeping things. We will take a picture with the young doctor here in the aula, together with the online professors. And then we will take a picture on the stairs, and we will ask the audience to already go to the Refter, where we'll then celebrate Dr. Zaccaria. And I now close this ceremony.